Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which is Gender as Trauma with Alex Yantafi. Our organization has released a statement on the topic of gender justice that our Executive Director, Marv Tell, and our Board Chair, Rebecca Stahl, would like to share with you. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Marv.
Thanks so much, Caroline. And I just would like to extend my welcome to all of you for joining us for this very important webinar in our anti-oppression series that we've been conducting for this past year. First and foremost, I really want to pay tribute and say my thanks to Alex for what I'll just call a lot of candor with grace. And just in preparation for this discussion that we'll have today, Alex worked with me and rest of our staff to, have us have a deeper appreciation and recognition for, not only the work that we have been trying to do, but many of our shortcomings. And Alex, I really appreciate you spending the time with us. Secondly, I want to thank all of you on the call that have also pointed out those shortcomings and held us accountable. And I would just say you've done it in a way that makes us feeling like you're calling us in rather than calling us out. And that, to me, is just candor with grace. I really, really appreciate that. So I thank you. And it's not only on the folks that are on the call, but that extend and go beyond in our broader SE community. March 31st is International Transgender Day of Visibility. And for organizations like ours, SEI, it's pretty easy to, in days of observance, to perform accountability. And we want to do that, but I think we have to do a lot more. We need to have a persistent commitment to do more and to do better, because the trans and the non-binary community, especially those who Black, Indigenous, people of color, you're facing escalating legislative attacks, discrimination, and violence. And here we are at SEI, and with all the things that we wish to do to move forward our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusivity. We've had a history of our own transphobic incidents, and we've fallen short of addressing them. We have been trying, but we're falling short. And this is an organizational failure, and we're committing ourselves to learning, growth, action, and repair. And for myself, as an individual that came to SEI 3 years ago as your executive director, I have a recognition and appreciation how I might be observed as a cis white man with privilege and power and a position. And I must tell you very bluntly and honestly, I came 3 years ago with really a need to catch up quickly, because I was isolated in really my desire to help bring this organization, but there's so much more work that needed to be done. And I am thankful to all of you for helping me to be in a better position to, help steward and lead this organization and taking these issues forward. So I thank you for that. And just from me personally and on behalf of the organization, I just offer my deep regrets and apologies for the lack of progress on our part. But I also want to offer the commitment that we are working and we're going to work hard at this. And And I thank you for giving me the space and offer this in the way that I hope you can appreciate and have a kind and respectful appreciation for. It's important to me that we get better. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca for her comments. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Marv. And Alex, I want to share in Marv's appreciation for you and for everybody in this community for holding us accountable. As Marv said, these issues around gender identity are often intersectional with so many other issues, with race, with class, with citizenship, with disability. And as an organization, we have fallen short. We, as many individuals within this organization, from students to assistants to faculty, staff, board, have done a lot of good work. As an organization, however, we have not done our job. And for the next, and I'm here to share a little bit of what we are doing, and feel free always to reach out to us at listening@traumahealing.org with more questions. But you know, we're doing a lot of work on training, specifically around Title VII required training. We are doing a lot of work around institutional accountability with evaluation processes and the ethics and grievance documents that are now available online. So people can submit those to us when there are issues that come up. And we have a process now to respond to them. As many of you have already heard, we have curriculum changes that are going to include systemic institutional trauma as well as generational trauma, things that have been lacking in the SE curriculum. And like many of you, I am an SEP, and I went through the training and recognized the lack of those issues in many of the training modules. But also as somatic experiencing practitioners, we understand that repair is possible. And our hope is to use SE tools to come from the heart, to come from knowledge, and to work together to understand each other better and to do better in the world as individuals and as an organization. SE changed my life. I expect it has changed the lives of every single person on this call. And we are going to use those tools from the heart as SE practitioners, as SE people, and move forward. So, like I said, you should have an email in your inbox with our statements. You should also, they'll be coming out in the newsletter, on our website already, in our social media. You can always reach out to us at listening@traumahealing.org. But Alex, I do not want to take any more time away from you. I am so excited personally for, I hope, obvious reasons, why I understand that gender is trauma and can feel like it for many reasons. So thank you so much for being here, for sharing your knowledge with all of us. And I personally am very grateful to you and cannot wait to hear this presentation.
Thank you so much, Rebecca and Marv. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Alex is an author, therapist, and SEP. Alex has researched, presented, and published extensively on gender, disability, sexuality, relationships, and HIV. Alex is the author of Gender Trauma, Healing Cultural, Social, and Historical Gendered Trauma, and co-author of the books How to Understand Your Gender, A Practical Guide for Exploring Who You Are, Life Isn't Binary, Hell Yeah Self-Care, a trauma-informed workbook, and How to Understand Your Sexuality, A Practical Guide for Exploring Who You Are with Meg John Barker. They also host the podcast Gender Stories. If you have any questions during our webinar today, please feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can hold them until the end, as Alex has created space for questions and answers at the end of their presentation. Just a quick reminder about Zoom. We do have the transcripts turned on, so closed captioning is available if you would like that. And we will have this available on our website for free as part of our anti-oppression series, so it will be there. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Alex. Alex, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you everybody for the warm welcome. I apologize if my voice is going to be a little bit croaky here on the beautiful Dakota Anishinaabe land where I'm located. It's really warmed up, and that means that it's open season on allergies for me. And so if I get croaky or I drink water during the presentation, which I most certainly will do, I hope you bear with me. I'm gonna share my slides, and mostly my slides are just there to like keep me on track so that I don't get too distracted by the many wormholes that we could go in when talking about gender. So thank you so much for the warm welcome, and thank you also for receiving my pretty candid, I would say, maybe because I live in the Midwest now, feedback and concerns to all of the SEI board and staff, and being willing to do more than just having a webinar this month. Alrighty, so as often, in a minute we're going to breathe, but I want to give you a bit of an overview of kind of what I'm going to talk about. One of the things that's really tricky about talking about this topic is that people come in at different levels of understanding and experience and knowledge. And so if at the beginning there's a lot of information you already know, I apologize, and hopefully there will be something of use at some point during this webinar. Alrighty, so my favorite thing to do at the beginning of any presentation that I've been doing is just an invitation to breathe. All of you, many of you are somatic providers. You know how this goes. We're not doing anything special. We're breathing all the time, but we're not always intentionally paying attention to our breathing. So I'm just gonna invite you to just pay attention to your breathing with as much curiosity and as much non-judgment as you're able in this moment. And if you want to, you can lower your gaze or close your eyes, but you don't have to. Whatever makes you feel most comfortable right now. And this is just a moment to say hello to your body mind, see how you're doing. If you need to kind of shift a little bit or grab a glass of water or whatever it is that your body mind needs to be able to be present for the next hour and 15 minutes. And as you breathe and notice with as much curiosity and as much judgment as you can manage in this moment how you're doing, I'm going to invite you to start getting in touch with how your body has weight and how gravity holds us here on this good green earth. And see if you can find that point of contact between your body and the support underneath you. And I'm going to invite you to just let yourself be held, even 5 or 10% more. Just really let that support underneath you, the loving gravity that holds us here, support you in this moment, rather than holding yourself up. And again, just noticing with curiosity what happens when you let yourself be held or relax into the support underneath you a little bit more. Again, it's just information, so being curious and as non-judgmental as we can right now. And then, much as I wish we could stay here even longer, I'm going to invite you to notice what's underneath the support that holds you. So if your feet are touching the ground, this is a good moment to really let yourself feel your feet on the ground, or just imagine that floor that's holding the chair, the couch, the bed, or the floor itself on which you're sitting right in this moment. I'm going to invite you to making connection to place. Here in the northern hemisphere where I'm located, things are starting to melt and flow, even though there's still snow on the ground where I am. So both things are happening at once. And I'm going to invite you to breathe into the relationship you have to your place where you're located and the history that brought you to this place and whatever relationship you are in with indigeneity, knowing that wherever we are on the globe, we're always on indigenous ground, and we always want to remember that and examine that relationship, not just with place, but with the traditional custodian of the lands on which we're located. And breathing into whatever history and relationship you have with this. Again, noticing with curiosity and as much non-judgment as you're able, what might come up for you as you are invited to consider this for this moment. Then I'm going to invite you, if you would like to breathe into the ancestral web that holds us. I know ancestors can be really complicated, and so you can also be in touch with ancestors of spirit, healing tradition, activism, liberation, whatever ancestors feel supportive and you're in good relationship with, knowing that we will not be the first and hopefully we will not be the last to be showing up to do this work today. And I'm definitely gonna be leaning into the ancestral web of gender-blessed ancestors, without whose work I would not be here. And then I'm gonna take one more breath into my hope that this work will be of service to those who come after us, sometimes called descendants, not just of blood, but of spirit, of healing, all those who are touched by healing work, and then all those who are touched by the healing that our healing work has hopefully impacted. So breathing into all those ripples of our work and taking that in. And then I'm gonna invite you to connect in whatever way feels good to you to this Zoom room full of hundreds of people who've come here to do this work together today. And all the other people who cannot be here synchronously, but will be here asynchronously listening to this webinar. So taking a moment to sense into that web of people within the SC community who want to be doing this work. And finally, coming back to yourself in this moment, in the here and now, taking a moment to say hello to your body again. If it feels good, to gently squeeze your upper arms or feel your body for a moment. You can do that, or maybe stretch. And as you do so, I invite you to look around and see if there is something that feels resourcing in a way that's comforting, neutral, or pleasant. And that can be a color or a shape or the smell of your tea or coffee or a familiar sound, whatever it is around you that feels like a good, comforting, or neutral resource in this moment. I'm going to invite you to notice and connect with that. And remember that you can always come back to that resource and come back to breath all through this conversation and all through this presentation. So thank you for slowing down with me. I know it always helps me feel more grounded when I do this, and when I do this together. You know, I do some of my own grounding before presenting, but there is something about doing this together, as my clients always tell me, in that co-regulating environment that feels so valuable and so important. So thank you for sharing that time of grounding and connecting with me. So one of the things that I always try to do when I present, and it's part of kind of slowing down and kind of connecting, is try to create some containment and some sense of relative safety. And it's even more important to do so, I think, when discussing gender, because gender can be so core to so many of us, and that means that it's precious and important and triggering in a lot of ways, right? Things that we love, we can feel very tender about, and even things that we don't love and feel uneasy about, we can feel very tender about. So whatever relationship we're in with gender, gender can be a really complex thing to talk about. And one of the complexity is that we do not come to this conversation neutral. It's not like we're just, you know, nobody has ever talked about this before. You know, in fact, I'm not really going to say anything new. In a way, I've kind of woven together a lot of different ideas in a specific way. But we're coming into this kind of cloud of trauma, this cloud of intergenerational, historical, cultural, and social trauma. And I'll unpack what I mean by that as part of this presentation. And so that can be really challenging, because all of us are carrying kind of our history, not just our individual history, but our collective history, our ancestral history, and as well as our relationship to this current, present, cultural, social, political moment. And so when we're talking about gender, it's like we're coming into this cloud of trauma together, and then we're trying to find our way back to each other through this cloud of trauma. And so it's so important to support nervous system regulation. And that's why I really wanted to start, which I always do anyway, but even more so kind of grounding, orienting, and going slowly. And probably for this presentation, I'm not gonna go as slowly as I want to, because I will start kind of sharing a lot of information with you. But if at any point you feel like that's too much and too fast, the webinar is being recorded. So give yourself the time to slow down, give yourself the time to ground, give yourself the time to orient to a resource around you, and give yourself the time to go slowly. And it's so important to do all of those things also when we're not just for ourselves, but when we're having connection with our colleagues around this, and also with our clients. Right, and I'll come back to this towards the end of the presentation, and really looking at different tools that we have in our toolbox as somatic providers to approach this. But that grounding, that orienting, that going slowly, for me is so foundational to what we do as somatic experiencing practitioner, and is so foundational to our work when we work with folks around exploring their relationships to gender, whatever that might be. So I want to start with a little background and some shared assumptions. And so I want to start from this kind of 10,000 feet view, if you like, of talking about what is gender in dominant culture now, right? And I don't think it's very difficult to find out what gender is in dominant culture right now, even though there have been increasing efforts, for example, to uncouple, in a somatic sense, kind of gender from things like toys and clothing. We're really very much not there yet. So for example, it's very much a binary world of boys and girls, men and women. And I'll say a little bit about what that framework is in a moment. But, if somebody's pregnant, one of the first questions is always, is it a boy or a girl? I remember when I was pregnant, I used to say, I wish it's a baby hippo, but I think it's going to be a human because I really love hippos. And then people thought I was really weird and would leave me alone in public places, and that was great too. But, you know, we have certain expectations, and even when we are working towards gender liberation, it's so easy to fall back into cis heteronormative expectations. And I will break down what that means as well in a moment. But we really, in terms of dominant culture, still very much boys and girls. That's what happens in schools when people are divided up. That's what happens with changing rooms in gyms. That's what's happening with sports and bathrooms. And we've heard more than any of us trans or non-binary folks have ever wanted to hear about bathrooms and sports, unfortunately, in the last couple of years, and even before that, but the last couple of years in what we now call the United States has been particularly violent, I would say, and in the United Kingdom as well. So in dominant culture, there's very much this idea that gender is a binary, that there are certain innate natural characteristics that come with being a girl and or being a boy, and that somehow those innate characteristics are tied to what is called our biology. And I say what is called our biology because science is not innocent from kind of ideology. And so in terms of the ideological framework, I'll come back to that, we're very much in a gender essentialist framework. But before I go into gender essentialism, let me make a note about language, because I've already used cis, for example. And so this is just a really brief note about language. Trans is a prefix that comes from the Latin, and it just means across from. And cis means on the same side as. When used with gender, transgender means that somebody has a gender identity that does not align with their gender assigned at birth. Cisgender means that somebody has a gender identity that does align with their gender assigned at birth. And non-binary is a vast landscape of identities that are not exclusively or not at all for our gender folks, masculine or feminine. So I just wanted to give just a little kind of the cliff notes of language. So much, I mean, all of that could be its own webinar, but that's not what we're doing today. So as I was saying, in terms of dominant culture, we're very much living in a gender essentialist world. And what does that mean in kind of the 5-second summary of what gender essentialism is? That if you're born with what people can identify as a vulva, then it means that you're a woman. And if you're born with what people identify as a penis, then you're a man. And gender essentialism is not just about conflating genitals with gender, but it's also about then saying that this kind of assignment based on your genitals also drives other characteristics, as we'll see in a moment. And gender essentialism is kind of a manifestation of biological determinism. And the idea that there are innate biological characteristics that drive kind of our thoughts, behaviors, capacity, and it's a very racist, colonial kind of scientific framework, but unfortunately is a racist, colonial scientific framework in which we're immersed, including kind of the medical taxonomies we use to talk about body, including the ways we talk about healing sometimes, even within kind of somatic communities. And so it's really important to be mindful that kind of that binary is not just about gender, but it's about this bigger picture of biological determinism. And again, there's so much more to say about that, but I wanted to make sure that kind of I set the scene around that. And so gender essentialism is not just you're a man and you're a woman if you have certain kind of genitals, is also you're expected to conform to a masculine or feminine role. And of course, those roles vary across history, varies across families, across cultures, and so on and so on. But there usually a set of characteristics that are expected and that are labeled as masculine and feminine. And there is an expectation that if this is what you're assigned at birth, that's going to be your identity. And then there's also an expectation that you'll be oriented towards the opposite gender, right? Because there are only two genders in this framework of gender essentialism. And so if you're assigned male at birth, you will perform some sort of masculinity. You'll identify as a man and you'll be attracted to women. And if you are assigned female at birth, you will conform to some sort of femininity. whatever that means in that historical, sociocultural, political moment. You will identify as a woman and you will be oriented towards men. And so gender essentialism also goes hand in hand with compulsive heteronormativity, right? So compulsive heteronormativity is the idea that it is kind of more, the baseline is for people to be attracted to the opposite gender in this gender essentialist framework. And then, there might be a small number of people who don't do that, but whole of our society, including the way we look at legislation, marriage, the way we organize changing rooms and sleepovers for kids and all of that is organized around this idea of compulsive heteronormativity. Again, to say more about that, but I'm very aware there's so much more to say. But this is really kind of foundational to what we're going to talk about, because although gender and sexuality are two distinct constructs, they're also connected and related. So what is gender if we don't want to subscribe to this kind of gender essentialist framework? And we could spend an hour and a half just talking about the gender essentialist framework. But I want to talk about more than that. And so from my perspective, I would say that gender is a large biopsychosocial construct, which includes aspects of identity, expression, role, and experience. So what does that mean? That there is an element, a biological element that is not just our gender, but our chromosomal characteristics, the way our brains work. And of course, we have categorized all of these things according to this category of gender, because that's kind of the ideology in which we are operating. And that could also be challenged. But so there is, for many people, kind of a biological element that is not just kind of the body as we see it, but also all of those other characteristics, chromosomal characteristics, the way our brain works, and so on. Then there's also the social, right? All the cultural messages, kind of our family history, the way that gender kind of has played out at the specific moment in time in which we're born, the place where we're born, the family in which we're born, the language we speak, and so on. And then there is a psychological component, which is our personal experience, our sense of self, the way we feel in relationship to this large biopsychosocial construct. And so from that point of view, then gender is a really confusing word, because we're using a word to talk about identity, we're using a word to talk about culture, social relationships, sense of self, and also to talk about bodies. Very confusing word. And it's not surprising that when we talk about gender, we often are tripping up with one another because we might not be talking about the same aspect of gender, for example. And so that's why I think it's helpful to think about how do we conceptualize gender if we don't want to kind of fall into the gender essentialist framework that we're all immersed in and have been brought up in by and large. But sometimes I also like to think in metaphors as a family therapist who uses a lot of narrative therapy. And my favorite metaphor of the last few years has been that of gender as a landscape. We talked about gender as like galaxies and systems and not binary, but I really landed on this landscape metaphor, and I've been here for a little while. And the reason why I like the metaphor of gender as a landscape is because how you go to a place when you're maybe 4 or 5 years old, and then you go back when you're 20 or 30 or 70, and it's the same place, and yet you have a different relationship to that place. And I feel that gender is very similar in that our relationship to gender changes across the lifespan for all of us, regardless of what our gender identity is. Most of us don't express our gender in the same way we do a 4-year-old as 40 or 50 years old. We might still maintain some of those elements. And I'm not just talking about identity, but I'm also talking about expression, which means the way we do our hair and makeup and clothes and mannerisms and all of those kind of things. And so just as we can be in a different relationship to place over time, our relationship to gender changes over time. And also, just as landscapes and places in the world, we don't need to have seen everywhere to know that places are real. Like for a long time, I never saw the Northern Lights, and I really wanted to see them. Eventually, I managed to see them in Iceland in the before times when we could travel on this But even before I saw them, I never thought, oh, this is something that's totally bogus and people are just making it up, because I haven't seen it with my own eyes. I haven't felt it with my own senses, right? I knew it was out there. It was just something I had not experienced. And so that's also why I like the metaphor of gender as a landscape, because there are many identities, experiences, and expression of gender that I might never experience, but that doesn't make them any less real, valid, or beautiful than my own experience of gender identity, or my own gender expression, or my own kind of gender history, if that makes sense. And I think that's really important, because we do have a certain cognitive bias as humans to assume, to generalize that our experiences are everybody's experiences. It's just human. But when we do that, we are basically saying like, well, here I am, the snow and trees, and this is my landscape, so everybody must have the same experience, right? And that is not the case. And so kind of that gives us a way to look at gender that's a little bit more expansive, because gender essentialism definitely wants us to contract somatically around gender. And kind of, if we look at gender as a landscape, there is an expansiveness that can come of that. And also there is a reassuring that even if people have never encountered a certain combination of gender identity and expression, like I said, that doesn't mean it's any less real, valid, or beautiful. So how did we get from kind of here to this place of gender essentialism, to this place of looking at gender in this very kind of constricted somatic view of like, there are only two genders and those are the two boxes that people need to fit in, and in so many ways, right? Whether it's public restrooms, whether it's education, whether it's legislation, whatever, whether it's healing, whether it's the way we're looking at bodies and brains and nervous systems. How do we get to this idea that we can only have this dualistic kind of male, female, gender essentialist place? Well, I and many other people, it's not just me who thinks that, would say that the gender binary is part of the ongoing settler colonial project. And what do I mean by that? First of all, I want to say a little bit about what I mean by ongoing settler colonial project. Especially here in what we call North America, and I would say what we call both the United States and Canada now, there can be this fantasy that settler colonialism is over and that this was something of the past. And so when I'm talking about the ongoing settler colonial project, it really indicates that the genocide of indigenous folks has not ended in many places in the globe, including where I am. And that the ongoing settler colonial project is the project of erasing and substituting the local population with settlers, basically. And this is an ongoing process that, for example, impacts many people around the globe in many different ways. Where I am, for example, line 3 is having a huge impact on local indigenous communities. And so when I talk about ongoing settler colonial project, it means this is not something that's in the past. This is not something that's finished. This is something that is still happening. And as part of that, there's also controlling of bodies. Ongoing settler colonialism and colonialism as well, depending on where you live, has to control both bodies to be successful in many, many ways. And so I'm gonna pause on that for a moment because there's more that I wanna say, but I'm gonna pause on that and just kind of offer a couple of moments to breathe. And I'm gonna invite you for a reflection moment, because it's easy to just keep going and throwing stuff at people when presenting. And I think it can be so helpful to kind of pause. So before I talk more about colonialism and the ongoing settler colonial project, I would love for you to just take a couple of minutes. This, in theory, could take much longer, but we're just going to take a few breaths to think about what you learned about history as you were growing up. And when you think about what you learned about history in elementary school and middle school and high school and even college, how was gender depicted in textbooks and narratives used to teach that history? Kind of what did you learn about kind of how gender manifested through history, basically? What were the narratives? What were the images and so on? And as you grew up, did you acquire information that was different from the learning that you had as a child? And if so, what was that new information? And what was that learning that was challenged with that new information? And how does what you've learned still, growing up, still impact the way you look at gender now, both within yourself and in others? And this is a lot of questions, and you can just pick one. I'm just going to take a few breaths here. And if you want to, you can put comments in the chat. If you want to share them with others, you can just take some notes, or you can just like sit with one or more of those questions. So hopefully you thought of something, and I'm not going to ask you to share with everybody. I mean, unless you want to, in which case you can absolutely share it. Or you might want to kind of save it for the question and answers if you want to. But hopefully you've had some thoughts about what that looked like. And for many of us, what that looked like was very binary. The idea of gender essentialism has been going on for as long as most of all of us, I would say, have been alive. And even if that is not necessarily what you've been taught culturally, that's definitely what's usually in kind of school curricula. That's the foundation of kind of medical textbooks. So kind of this idea that there have only ever been two genders, right? And even throughout history, I remember growing up and learning about this is what women did, and this is what men did in the Middle Ages, and this is what kind of women did and men did during the Renaissance or whatever it was, right? It was always this pretty binary, right? And so part of the ongoing settler colonial project has been to really not just continuously try to replace the local indigenous populations with settlers, but also to erase and rewrite history. And so one of the ways in which history has been erased and rewritten is that this kind of gender expansiveness that we're seeing that often people attribute to like young people and Generation Z. I have a lot of parents who are like, the internet made my child trans. And I'm like, I don't think so, because there was no internet when I was 7. And I still had a sense that my gender wasn't quite what people thought it was. And gender diversity and creativity have always existed all across the globe and still exist. But historically, some of the best evidence that gender expansiveness is part of humanity is that it's always been there. And for example, in the pictures here, the square picture is an effigy of the Phrygian goddess Cybele, was very popular in the area of the world where I come from, the Mediterranean. And the kind of rectangular vertical picture is the statue of her priestesses, the Galli, who we now would call maybe trans feminine people. They were usually, but not always, folks that we would call assigned male at birth in the language we have now, who would kind of dress and present in feminine ways and might also perform body modification rituals that involved kind of modifying their bodies in a number of ways. And so that gender diversity and creativity has always existed. I think, when parents, because I'm a family therapist, ask me, why is my child trans? What's the explanation? I say, this is just part of who we are as humans. And the best evidence we have of that really is from history, because that's always existed. And that gender expansiveness has never stopped existing all over the globe. On the picture on the top left is a picture of a celebration of La Madonna di Montevergine. It was one of the Black Madonnas in the southern regions of Italy. We have several, and that's a picture of the Femminelli, who would be, again, usually, but not always, folks assigned male at birth who present in gender expansive ways and embrace femininity and are part of kind of the ritual, the sacred rituals of celebrating La Madonna di Montevergine. And that is something that I did not know anything about growing up. For example, even though that's where I grew up, again, kind of the different ways in which colonialism and the forced Christianization of many regions kind of erase was this gender expansiveness that is everywhere. Then the middle picture is a picture of a Two Spirits Pride, and Two Spirit is a Anglo-based word, and it's a pan-Indigenous word that not all Indigenous folks use, but some do, that was created in the 1980s by some North American, mostly Indigenous folks that wanted to find a way to reclaim words and identities and expressions that had been lost through the ongoing settler colonial process. And Two Spirit doesn't just indicate gender, but it can also indicate sexuality. And again, it's not a word that all Indigenous folks identify with, but it's a word that's often used within a North American context to talk about trans and queer, what we would say in an Anglo context, folks within Indigenous communities, but that's also reductive because it's still use an Anglo framework. But it's just to give like a brief explanation of what I mean by that. But it's much more than that. And again, that could be its own webinar that would not be given by me, but I've got some great folks to recommend if you ever want to find out more about that. And then the bottom picture on the left is a picture of Hitras, who sometimes, again, in Anglo framework, are thought of as kind of trans people in India, but they're not trans. My understanding from my Indian friends is that it's a whole different concept of gender, just as Into Spirit is a whole different concept of gender and sexuality, because gender and sexuality are not categorized in this gender essentialist framework that I was talking about in certain kind of regional and cultural and the spiritual traditions. So the gender expansiveness has never stopped existing. In every area of the world, there are gender expansive folks, and they have their own specific relationship to place and culture and often social role. But that is not something that most of us were brought up knowing, for example. And part of the fact that that most of us didn't know that growing up is that our current understanding of gender is deeply impacted by those settler colonial processes. And gender, when we move away from gender essentialism, was and is much more a concept that's connected with identity, expression, and role rather than biology. And I put biology in air quotes because I think when we think biology, we still think of, oh yes, sex is different than gender and there are only two sexes. And that's a really reductionist view of biology. And it's biology that's still immersed in the gender essentialist framework and that has been increasingly challenged by most geneticists and hormone researchers and biologists as well. And so kind of we lost that expansiveness in language, we lost that expansiveness in the way of thinking about ourselves and one another. And partially we lost that expansiveness because controlling bodies, gender, relationships, language, culture, and spirituality is an essential element of the settler colonial states. If you allow expansion in terms of collective soma, that it does not serve this idea of bringing one religion, one people to a certain region in the world and substituting the local indigenous population with those other settler folks. And again, there's so much more to say about that kind of control of body minds that is so essential to settler colonialism. And I definitely go in a lot more depth about this in the book as well. And I have a lot of resources. I also have a 5 or 6 page handout of further reading that I'm happy to send to SEI, and maybe it can be uploaded to the web together with the webinar, so that if you want to read more about this, there are many people who are smarter, more insightful than I am that have written about this. But what I really want to focus on today is this rigid gender binary that we think of as natural, scientific, and part of our kind of everyday lives is actually part of historical, cultural, and social trauma, and intersects with all other aspects of identities and experiences. And when I talk about historical trauma, I'm using a word that, as far as I know, was first used in the 1980s by Lakota scholar Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart, where she compared folks who had experienced the Holocaust to Lakota people who were the descendants of folks who had experienced the Wounded Knee Massacre. And she identified certain characteristics of people who had experienced historical trauma. And historical trauma is different than intergenerational trauma. Of course, historical trauma is also intergenerational, but not all intergenerational trauma is historical. And what I mean by that is that historical trauma is linked to specific historical events. For example, the transatlantic slave trade, or the massacre of Wounded Knee, or the Holocaust. And it does impact the generations that come after us. But intergenerational can also be just specific to our family. So for example, my family has a history of domestic violence that I've been able to disrupt for the first time. And that's historic, it's intergenerational. We could say it's historical in terms of misogyny, but it's really intergenerational. But it's not historical. It's not linked to a specific historic event. And of course, both historical trauma impacts the way in which we think and relate to one another on a cultural and social level, if that makes sense. And so the impact of historical trauma that Professor Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart identified was that people who had experienced and whose ancestors had experienced specific events in history were experiencing higher rates of depression, higher rates of anxiety, higher rates of substance use, higher rates of alcoholism, higher rates of suicidality, both in terms of suicidal thoughts and attempts, or dying by completing suicide, and higher rates of intimate partner violence and abuse. Now, if this list of symptoms or challenges, whatever we want to call them, issues, we're so immersed in kind of, at least in mental health, medical taxonomy, that sometimes it's hard to get away from that language seems familiar, is because most minoritized populations manifest and have challenges around those issues. And that is not an accident, because most minoritized folks are impacted by historical, systemic, cultural, and social trauma in a number of ways. And so we see those kind of challenges and issues surface again and again in historically minoritized populations, including around gender issues, which I'll go more in depth in a moment. And one more thing that I want to say before I give some example is that we cannot talk about gender without talking about race and indigeneity, and so without taking what is called an intersectional perspective. And intersectionality is not an additive model. It doesn't mean like gender plus race plus class plus disability equals a certain experience. It's a term that was first coined by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw in a very specific context to talk about the experience of Black women and girls within the carceral prison industrial complex. carceral judicial system. And it's really about a systemic analysis of power and privilege and oppression. And so it's how the systems kind of impact certain folks in a specific way because of the intersection of different issues such as, gender and race, for example. And so we cannot talk about gender without taking an intersectional perspective, because the way we're gendered is also deeply dependent on the way that we are also racialized or normed in a number of ways. So for example, there was a really wonderful thread on Twitter recently by a Black woman scholar was talking about how many Black women have started to identify as non-binary women to indicate how the very concept of womanhood within this kind of current social political context, it's really linked to white womanhood. And so Black women, there's almost an impossibility of womanhood for Black women. And again, I really encourage you to kind of go to the sources of Black scholars have written about this and in much more depth. So we cannot take away gender from kind of race, indigeneity, class, disability, and there's so much more to say for each and every one of those categories. So when I say that the rigid gender binary is a form of historical, cultural, and social trauma that impacts all of us, albeit in different ways, what do I mean? I'm going to give you some example, and I'm really going to invite you to take some breaths because there's a lot, and there's a lot more examples in the book. And I know I had to take a lot of breaks writing this book because there's a lot of trauma that it's rooted in gender and the intersection of gender with other identities and experiences. For example, Indigenous women, girls, and Spirit folks are more likely to be murdered, including dying in police custody and due to police brutality or go missing. And those cases are very much underreported. And even when they're reported, the media often uses victim blaming language that kind of frames the Indigenous woman, girl, or Spirit person as somehow, not living up to the standards of citizenship that are expected. So either being a drug user or doing something that is seen as negative in kind of dominant Anglo culture. So even when there is a report, there's a lot of victim blaming language, and there isn't an acknowledgement that there is a direct relationship between settler colonialism and what is happening with Indigenous women, girls, and Spirit folks in terms of going missing or murdered in the US. And there's, again, some great literature and reports that point to that relationship. Then if we look at kind of trans and or non-binary people and populations, we're 10 times more likely than the general population to struggle with suicidality and are at higher risk of dying by suicide. And so that's quite the difference in terms when we compare with cis heteronormative populations, and even when we compare with cisgender gay and lesbian folks. And I'm leaving bisexual folks out because bi and trans populations actually experience pretty similar risk, kind of higher risk within the what we call the LGBTQ community. Then if we look at Black folks, Black women are 2 to 6 times more likely to die of complications from childbirth, regardless of education or income. This has been, almost everybody knows this, and yet do we really know it? Like, do we really truly understand, if we are not Black, of course, how folks are treated both, not just during childbirth, but generally how Black people are treated within the healthcare system. For example, usually they don't have as much access to effective pain management because there's still this really racist idea rooted in biological determinism that somehow Black folks have a different tolerance of pain than white folks, right? So those ideas persist in our system. If we look at kind of Muslim women, Islamophobia really contributes to global violence towards Muslim people in general, people perceived to be Muslim. But Muslim women are often more likely to be harassed or attacked for wearing visible signs of their cultural or religious affiliation, such as hijab. And even if, and again, there's more to say about that around the policing of gender and what's expected and femininity. And even if we just look at straight up kind of, cisgender men, even cisgender straight men, there is plenty of research to indicate that toxic masculinity leads to poorer health for men generally. For example, research has shown that men are often less likely to seek and access healthcare, even when they need to. And boys are usually actually exposed and encounter violence much younger, and especially Black boys encounter violence at a much younger age. So whichever way you look at it and whichever population you look at it, just like many other forms of historical trauma, everybody in our society is impacted by rigid gender binaries, and again impacted in different ways. And we all have, and when we take an intersectional lens, the folks who are most impacted are usually Indigenous, Black and Brown, trans feminine folks, because of the intersection of misogyny, racism, and so on and so on. But there's really, even if we looked at kind of cis white straight men, they're also impacted by kind of a rigid gender binary as traumatic. So I'm going to take a moment to breathe, because that was a lot of trauma. We've been talking about this for a little bit. We still have a little while to go, because I chose to do a 90-minute webinar, because I've learned that an hour is just not enough to talk about this. So just taking a moment to breathe in whatever way feels good to you. Drink some water. Even though I talk about this all the time, I still feel in my body kind of the heaviness, the constriction, the weight of all the ways in which this rigid gender binary impacts not just my community, but everybody else too in my broader community. And of course, if you're watching a recording while you're listening to me, you can pause and breathe as long as you need here. For today, I'm kind of gonna move forward, and I really wanna start looking at what does it mean for us as somatic providers, as healers. One thing that I love about our somatic experiencing community is that it is an interdisciplinary community. That's why I chose somatic experiencing over other ways of getting somatically trained as a mental health provider. And so that's why I'm using this broader kind of umbrella of healing. I think that is something that is a gift in our community, that we can learn from each other and also support one another and support our clients in this very holistic way, support our clients' body, minds, as well as our own. So as healers, if we're not careful, whether we're body workers, whether we're mental health providers, acupuncturists, meditation teachers, medical doctors, and yes, and those were all folks that were in like my training cohort. It was really beautiful to learn alongside so many other healing providers. If we're not careful, we risk turning kind of our healing room into a mirror of the world out there. And this is actually a concept that comes from a paper from the 90s, Mustin Hara paper of the therapy as a mirrored room, which is also in the further reading handout. And so if we're not careful, we're going to be reproducing all the systems of oppression in our own healing work if we are not aware of kind of how certain things such as gender that we take for granted, maybe it should not be taken for granted when we're talking about trauma, because they carry this weight of historical, cultural, and social trauma for pretty much for ourselves and pretty much anyone we work with. And so I want to take a moment to talk about cisgenderism specifically. And I want to talk about cisgenderism because unlike transphobia, and of course it would be really important to talk about transphobia too, and I experienced plenty of it in the world, including through somatic experiencing training, to be completely honest. And it was at a time where there was not a grievance process, unfortunately. So it's good to know that SCI now is a grievance process. But, you know, we could talk about transphobia, but because I really want to talk about gender and the rigid gender binary as trauma, I'm going to focus on cisgenderism instead. And so what is cisgenderism and why is it different from transphobia? While transphobia is, you know, literally the fear of trans folk, right? There's usually an emotional piece and not understanding and mocking and erasing a disgust that people might feel towards trans and or non-binary folks specifically. Cisgenderism is not, is actually an ideology. And an ideology is a system of meaning that is reflected in thought and practice. And it focuses on function rather than emotion. And what I mean by a system of meaning reflected in thought and practice is that it's very pervasive. So, you know, cisgenderism is kind of peppered through all of our education. It's kind of really in the way we write legislation, in the way we learn about bodies and relationships and so on and so on. And cisgenderism is about systems and not individual. It's about maintaining a gender essentialist system at heart. And part of maintaining that gender essentialist framework is delegitimizing people's own designation of their own genders and their own body minds. And of course, that one of the most obvious manifestations of cisgenderism is the delegitimizing of trans and or non-binary folks' identities, but it is not the only manifestation of cisgenderism. For example, cis women who have PCOS often are victim of cisgenderism because they're seen as not conforming to ideas of femininity, right? Black women athletes, their gender is often questioned again and again by the media when they're performing in a way that's considered to be beyond what a woman, in air quotes, should be able to perform there. And it's not an accident that it's only Black women whose gender is questioned and whose athletic abilities are questioned during the Olympics, for example. We've seen, or other kind of sport events, and we've seen that again and again. So that's a delegitimizing of people's own genders and kind of body minds. And cisgenderism treats a particular alignment between gender identity and gender assigned at birth as kind of natural, healthy, the norm, and as such, that means inherently superior, right? It's the idea that it is normal, in air quotes, to have men and women, and then there's like everybody else over there, right? It is normal, in air quotes, again, to just say ladies and gentlemen, and separate kids into boys and girls in school, to separate kids by gender when delivering sex education, and so on and so on. To talk about male body and female body, those are all forms of cisgenderism. And then if we want to look at manifestation of cisgenderisms, and that are maybe a little bit more specific to trans and non-binary folks, it's things like using the wrong pronouns or names for clients or colleagues, usually known as misgendering. Assuming a binary identity for everybody. You know, I remember a state conference where I'd complained for a few years about not having an all gender restroom. And one year I turned up and I asked yet again about the all gender restroom, and I was given this key to the one bathroom that was somewhere, you know, and I thought, well, how do you know that I'm the only person who needs this all gender restroom, right? So there was an assumption being made, and often we make assumptions that everybody's going to have a binary identity around us. And that we can recognize those who don't. It's also another manifestation of cisgenderism is, like I said, is kind of treating the people's own understanding of their body minds or genders as not valid. For example, a therapist assuming that a woman who's intersex has a non-binary gender inherently, whereas that may or may not be true for the person in question. And I should say that this concept of cisgenderism is the term was first coined and is used by my good Australian colleague, Gabby and Sarah. And he has written quite a lot about this, if you're interested in finding out more. Another manifestation of cisgenderism is constructing people whose genders or body minds are delegitimized as marked categories or effects to be explained. So for example, seeing trans folks, non-binary folks, or gender expansive folks as categories that are set aside from the baseline, right? And then, of course, treating people's identity as disordered. So, for example, seeing a girl who was assigned male at birth and identifies as a girl as having a mental health issue. And that's, again, is something that has been challenged again and again. And hopefully in ICD-11, finally, we'll see that shift of gender dysphoria from the mental health category to a sexual health category, just like pregnancy, for example, so that people can still have access to healthcare services without having to carry the stigma of their identity being seen as a mental health issue. Of course, we could also look at the stigma of just mental health issues, conditions in general, but that's not the focus of our webinar today. So somatically, this is really important for us to think about because there is so much dissociation, shame, and blame that is necessary to maintain cisgenderism. So for example, within a cisgenderist framework, people like John Gray have sold millions and millions and millions of books with, men are from Mars and women are from Venus and all their spin-offs. And in Mars and Venus in the bedroom, literally John Gray talks about women encouraging women to dissociate from their bodies and think about something else to have maintenance sex with their husbands. And so when I'm talking about that compulsive cis heteronormativity being really impactful on all of us, we see that kind of there's literally an invitation often to women and femme folks to dissociate from the body in order to perform what is expected, right? Or if we think about young girls and the double bind of having to be aware of their erotic capital, but also not so aware. And so being hypersexualized at the same time as being blamed for being assaulted or being abused or being inappropriately sexualized by adults, for example, right? And so, again, there's so much more to say about this, but often dissociation, shame, and blame really come into the room when we're talking about gender. And so when people come to us as providers, as healers, and come to us with their whole body mind, including their relationship to gender, which may or may not be the focus of the work they want to do with us, again, they're coming into this cloud of trauma, for some people, especially trans and non-binary folks, they're carrying a history of being pathologized for their gender, but also more broadly, people are coming in with this kind of stereotype threat, right? Black women coming into therapy or healing spaces, for example. So this, again, is not just about trans and non-binary people. This is about gender liberation and how cisgenderism is so pervasive and impacts all of us. And of course, kind of the micro and macro aggressions that we can experience when coming into kind of a healing context. And so what are the somatic techniques that can really help us? And I wish I could have really started from there, but I feel like I needed to do all the other parts before getting here. Some of the useful somatic techniques that can really help us as somatic providers to acknowledge that that's how people are coming into our healing spaces and to more effectively work with them is the importance of really orienting to who we are, the space we're in. And there's so much more to say about that. We orient our clients through how we're presenting ourselves in our website and our bios and the images we use and how we describe ourselves. We are orienting our clients through the paperwork that we use, especially as mental health providers. We are orienting our clients by the pictures that we have on our walls and the books we have on our bookshelves, right? It's like there's so many different aspects of orientation. And of course, we can help orient our clients through direct communication, but there's so much that we might be taking for granted and have go unexamined when when we think about the issue of orienting. It's not just when we're one-on-one with our clients, it's also how we present ourselves to the world. It's also another great somatic tool that we have at our disposal is the ability to give ourselves and our clients time to settle. And so, not rush as much as we can, have time to ground, paying attention to attunement, going slow, titrating our intervention, and so on and so on. And there is so much more than I could say about this here again. But for example, even in SC training, kind of often, at least when I took the training, there was this like immediate assumption of trust and collegiality. And many of us are like minoritized folks are not going to come in with trust and collegiality because we've been in trainings before. Like I was the only visible trans person in my cohort during beginner and intermediate, right? It's like that is its own experience. And so the idea of like even titrating the expectation of trust in a training, as well as titrating the expectation of trust with clients, right? Often clients, even when they get apologetic, I'm sorry, but I'm like, I don't expect you to trust me. You don't know me. Like you just met me or we met twice. Why would you trust me, right? It's okay. It's okay to not trust me, titrating trust, titrating relationship, because part of white supremacy is also an entitlement to comfort and immediate connection and relationship. So we really need to pay attention to attunement and titrate our expectation for relationship with our clients. And so I promise this is the last slide and then we're going into Q&A. So what else is in our toolbox, right? And each one of those we could break down into like 1 hour webinars for each one of those, kind of even just titrating and settling and practicing it in relation to gender in particular. What's in our toolbox is also a way to think about trauma. And I'm going to encourage you to think about cisgenderism as a form of inescapable attack, especially for trans and non-binary folks, but also for like Black folks, for Muslim folks, for like mostly minoritized folks. And in some ways, even if you take as it was Liz Wise and somebody else in the 80s, talk about even if you just take cis, I didn't say cisgender in the 1980s, but just kind of straight up white, straight men, right? Even they are under a form of inescapable attack by cisgenderism. So even if you take the most privileged identity within, in a systemic analysis of power and privilege, everybody is really impacted by cisgenderism as a form of inescapable attack. So this, again, it's what I'm using it as a framework is the tools and language we have in SC, right? And so because it is a form of inescapable attack, there is no absolute safety, and it can be really challenging to have a false sense of safety. However, what we can do is support our clients to orient towards relative safety, or maybe even understanding the idea of relative safety, and how important it is to have relative safety in our life to be able to recharge before being able to go out into the world and engage in an unsafe, right, environment. And so even things, again, if I think about training, kind of letting people choose their dyads or triads, or having affinity groups kind of based on identities and experiences that can be self-selected, or with clients, but just really taking time to explore what are the places in which you feel your body can expand, right? Because when it comes to gender policing and cisgenderism, it's like our collective soma is like this, right? It's all tight and wound up. And so where are the places where you can kind of expand and experience that sense of relative safety, and therefore nurture that ventral vagal connection that is so vital for all of us humans, to live a grounded life in relationship with other people, right? And so how do we support clients to orient towards this idea of relative safety? Also, really going to invite you to challenge that overcoupling that it's inherent in cisgenderist ideology between body and gender, right? often when I do trainings that are more kind of transgender 101, people are like, well, sometimes it's hard because I'm not used to those pronouns, or I see this person with a beard and they want me to use she, and I just can't, right? In SC terms, that's an overcoupling. We're overcoupling bodies with gender. We're seeing somebody and we're putting them in categories because that's what we've been taught to do through the lens of cisgenderist ideology. So there is a whole process of unlearning that we need to do. But we also need to challenge the undercoupling of benevolent liberalism. And what do I mean by that? So the undercoupling of benevolent liberalism is, it's fine. I don't care if you're trans. I don't care what pronouns you use. I don't even see color, right? It's like, or disabled, why do you use that word to describe yourself, right? So the benevolent liberalism is an undercoupling. It's in SC terms, in my opinion, it's a not seeing actually the lived experience of the person in front of you, and the fact that through a positioning theory lens, we're all positioned in certain ways and therefore experience the world and relationship in certain ways. And so from an SC lens, we're really doing this dance between overcoupling and undercoupling to find a place of potential expansion and gender liberation, right? And as well as nurturing ventral vagal connection, is so important to understand that if fracture occurs, there needs to be focus there, that we cannot kind of bypass rupture. And I think all of us who've been hurt know that we cannot bypass rupture, but somehow when we are the ones who have hurt other people, we totally want to bypass it. If we're hurt, we're like, yes, you should pay attention to me. But if we hurt somebody else, we're like, oh, I didn't mean it, or I'm a good person. So we really need to understand when we're working with client, if there is a rupture around cisgenderism and its impact, that we cannot come back to a ventral vagal connection without addressing that rupture. And finally, another SC tool is really understanding and supporting coherence for ourselves and our clients. So often people are really gaslit on a cultural, systemic, and historical level around what they're experiencing around gender from an intersectional perspective. And so being able to understand what cisgenderism is, how it impacts people, it also helps us as provider support coherence for ourselves and our clients, and again, and if you're SC students who haven't gotten to advanced yet, unless the curriculum has changed, you might not know what I mean about coherence, but I'm not going to go there because of time. But really, it's kind of not telling people, oh, you're exaggerating, or that's unlikely to happen, or I don't understand why you don't feel safe everywhere, right? But really understanding that actually sometimes fear or anger or emotions that we might not be comfortable with and want to kind of bypass to come back to baseline and to come back to regulation, that actually sometimes fear, anger, a dysregulated response are actually coherent to the situation. And rather than forcing people back into a regulated state that we're more comfortable with, can we hang in there with the righteous rage? Can we hang in there with the activation that somebody, including ourselves, might feel in certain circumstances? And can we see that as coherent and appropriate to the situation again? I should have chosen 2 hours instead of an hour and a half. All right, I'm aware that I'm gonna break my promise to you. That's a rapture already of leaving more time for question, and also that apparently I had another slide put in there, which we don't have to spend much time on, and you can totally have access to my slides and the further reading handout. But really, this is kind of what would it look like to really practice gender rewilding and to nurture liberation when it comes to gender? And it cannot be a first order change, as we call it in systemic therapy, a superficial change. It needs to be a second order change, a deep systemic change around our mental frameworks. And as Dr. Michael Yellowbird would say, a form of neurodecolonization. And I'm not going to go through all of this because in some ways I've already covered it. But the thing that I want to end on is really that healing from any sort of rigid gender binary trauma cannot be an individual process, but it has to be a collective endeavor. There needs to be a recognition about our individual nervous system responses are connected to the collective soma experiences. And we need to be able to draw on the wisdom of our ancestors and use somatic and creative approaches if we are to heal from this inescapable attack of cisgenderism and move towards a world where gender liberation is possible and is viewed as an essential component of our collective liberation. And on that, that was really the last slide. I know we only have 5 minutes for questions. I'm sorry. I'm also happy to hang out for a little bit longer. If people have time, I have time. I always have a little cushion after my presentations, and I would be happy to hang out for another 15, 20 minutes. But you can also email me at alex@alexyantafi.com. You can follow me on Twitter if you do Twitter. But for now, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for sharing the space with me. And I hope that the space was helpful in some way, shape, or form. And I look forward to your questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you all. And I will put my address or I will ask somebody to put my email address in the chat. I don't know if I can put it in there. But so yes, any questions?
I actually have somebody sent me a question. It says, could you say something more about whether repair is possible between a well-meaning, cisgendered person and one who identifies as non-binary? I've seen it happen so many times that someone makes a mistake and misgenders another, and despite discussing, addressing, and taking responsibility, that the wound is so painfully deep that repair is not possible. Only witnessing from a grounded place and with compassion.
That is a great question. Well, you know, I have one of my partners is a cisgender man, so I'm pretty sure repair is possible. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been together for 20 plus years. And that there's going to be rupture between cis folks and trans folks and non-binary folks because our experiences are not the same. And so, you know, and in that specific case, I think what's really interesting is that even in the question, there's a lot of intention. And often when I facilitate things, I always say, can we imagine best intention from one another? So I'm never going to assume that somebody is misgendering me on purpose, unless I can see they're doing it on purpose, right? Generally, I'm going to assume that it's not something that people do on purpose. But if then the focus, I think the rupture, the repair is possible, but it's challenging if the cis person is doing a lot of focus on their intention. I didn't mean it, or I feel bad, or I did, you know, if there is just, and then that puts a toll and that labor on the trans and non-binary person, right? Or for example, if there is apology, but then there is no work behind it, right? I misgender you, and then I apologize, and then I do it again and again and again. You know, or maybe just the person is like, I don't want to put in the labor to have a relationship with you because you don't feel like a safe person or you have some work to do, right? So I think that repair is absolutely possible. And first of all, as work, repair is work. So trans and non-binary folks don't owe any cis folks that work. And often there's an expectation and an entitlement to that work. I remember even in my own training, somebody misgendered me in a dyad, and I was like, oh, that's my pronoun, no worries, you didn't know, you know, it was beginners. And then was just like coming at me for more apology later on. And I was like, I'm really not available for this conversation, and then got angry. And often that's how those interactions go, right? If trans and non-binary folks, if we don't behave in a way that's like seen as kind, or if we get upset, or if we have the wrong tone, right? So I think repair is possible, but there needs to be an acknowledgement that for you, this is cis person, you know, this is one incident of misgendering. For me, maybe it's like incident 105 today, and I don't wanna repair, or maybe like this is incident 30 in 6 hours of training, and I'm tired of repairing. And right, so I think that repair is possible as long as it's not expected. And I think it's that expectation that often actually damages the relationship, that entitlement to kind of trans and non-binary folks, kindness, that entitlement, not just to our kindness, but our patience and education, if that makes sense. I don't know if that makes sense, and I'm trying not to be harsh, but I'm also trying to be very honest in terms of what I've witnessed. And I think there's a lot of cis people going, but I'm trying. And I'm like, that's beautiful. Please try harder, read some books, talk to, like, take a training. Don't expect the person, like your peer or your client, to be available for repair necessarily. And don't be angry if somebody's not available for repair in that moment. Doesn't mean that they're never going to be available for repair, but it just means right now they don't have that capacity. I don't know if that makes sense or it's helpful, but that's what I got. Any other questions?
We have several, actually.
I'm happy to hang out if SCI is happy for me to hang out.
Some more people are sending them to me, so I'll just keep asking.
That's great.
One here is it possible for a cisgender person to receive feedback without making me take care of their feelings?
I sure hope so. Yes, I think it is possible, but it takes a lot of regulation, just as it's possible for me as a conditionally white person to take feedback and work on my own feelings. I think it's possible. I think it just takes a lot of, and not to make parallels, but there's also parallels at times. It's complicated. But I think it's possible, but it takes a lot of kind of self-regulation and self-soothing. And it takes a lot of being grounded in not having the locus of control around our integrity outside of ourselves. Like if we know we're acting in integrity and we're doing our best, and at ART, we are people who are trying their hardest, and we have a community of accountability around us that reflects that to us. I think that's possible. I think when it gets hard is when I need the blessing of the minoritized person to feel that I'm a good person. I remember like a colleague contacted me going when the whole like Ken Zucker situation was exploding, going, just wanting to know what I felt and what I was like, I don't know what you're looking for. It feels like you're looking for my blessing and I'm not the transphobe. And I don't think anybody is. So I think it's possible, but it just does take that kind of self-regulation, not looking for not looking for validation that you're a good person. Like that's for therapy. That's not for the person who's giving you feedback, if that makes sense. Maybe that's a little harsh, sorry.
Well, maybe I'm harsh too, but I agree with you.
So it's a little direct. We're all practitioners, so hopefully I can be that direct.
I hope so. There was actually a question an hour or so ago about the term for the non-cis folks in the Mediterranean.
Oh, femininity. They still exist. They still participate in the celebration in February of La Madonna di Santa Vergine. And it's in the Campania region of Italy, femininity.
Awesome, thank you. I'm trying to scroll through comments here, so
go for it.
Okay. One says, fantastic seminar. I would agree.
Okay.
Could you please talk about more? Could you please talk more about that space between undercoupling and overcoupling? Yes,
I could talk a lot about that.
Thank you.
So yeah, and I mean, I'm still like, this is still all stuff that I'm processing through, because Irony always, that the space between undercoupling and overcoupling, it's just like in every other kind of healing process with our clients, we're trying to find that sweet spot, right? The sweet spot where there is that coherence for people, whatever that looks like. And so that sweet spot for me when it comes to gender in a more collective way, not, we also all have our own individual history, experiences, trauma, and so on. But in a collective way, like I said, it's not overcoupling body with gender, and so not being so fixated that certain bodily characteristics represent somebody's gender. And so, for example, and that does take a lot of work to challenge that overcoupling, right? Certain bodies or certain mannerisms. So, for example, just to stay personal and always put in other people, often people are like, it's really hard for me to use they or he because you exude such a feminine energy. You can tell I'm a pagan, so I hang out around a lot of people that talk about energy, you know. And it's like, well, I don't know what you mean by feminine energy, but yes, like if I'd been born a cis boy, you know, I would have been like very queer boy, queer masculinity, right? But for me, I'm exuding a queer feminine masculinity, for want of better words, but other people are seeing it in this very binary way, right? And so that overcoupling means that we're attributing a lot of mannerisms, ways we look, identities, way we speak to certain body. And the undercoupling is that it doesn't even matter to me. I don't even see your gender, right? And we can say that about any form of expression, or I don't know why you talk about yourself as a disabled person, myself as being disabled, like I don't see you that way, right? That's the undercoupling, because I want you to understand what my experience is. So that sweet spot between overcoupling and undercoupling is ultimately an acknowledgement of the person in front of you and of yourself as fully human, and as such, as your identities and experiences being fully valid. So rather than trying to kind of counter argue somebody's experience or explain it to them, or kind of move away from because it makes us uncomfortable, can we meet the other person in this very grounded place where we're not trying to either really still be in that cisgenderist framework, basically that's what overcoupling is, but also not move into that place of denial that is kind of that benevolent liberalism. It's ultimately a place of denial of collective issues and systemic issues of power and privilege and oppression. So the sweet spot is, can we meet here in the middle, if we're both invested in doing that, or if we're all invested in doing that, and ground and try to truly understand one another and try to not invalidate one another because of that overcoupling or undercoupling. That's that. I don't know if I've asked. I'm not sure if I answered the question that was being asked, but that's what I got for now.
I'm a little embarrassed to admit this, being an SEP, and I spend a lot of time thinking about SE every day. I never had thought about it that way, so thank you. Very personally, that was an incredible explanation. That was really helpful.
Oh, good. I spent a lot of time thinking about this. So
that is, and we get to benefit from that. So thank you. I am very cognizant that you have been here for 2 hours. Are you really okay to keep going?
I'm really okay to keep going. If people are here and engaged, I'm totally okay to keep going for another 10 minutes or so. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you. So then the next question is, curious your opinion on how much of the healing work requires community level process versus individual one-on-one process as in a counseling engagement?
Oh, what a great question. I honestly, I don't know. It depends on so many factors, right? I think there has to be both, right? There has to be collective engagement in terms of like persistence, right? And accountability, right? How do we as a community of providers or community of SC practitioner want to engage with this issue, right? That collective piece is essential, I would say. And also there is where humans and the individual person-to-person piece is also essential. So I don't know that I can quantify. For me, it's very much of a both end, maybe because I'm a person who lives in the liminal, but I think we need both the collective and the individual. There's not one without the other, right? And we also need to understand that not every individual will be available in the same way. And then no community is a monolith, right? Like within trans and non-binary community, not everybody's going to agree with me about some of the stuff I presented. Not everybody's going to agree with me that repair is possible or even wanted. Like we all get to, so that individual and collective really is a both and for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. Whoa. Sorry.
That's okay.
Very insightful. Yeah, very insightful webinar with fantastic learnings. How do we integrate this knowledge in peer support practice, especially for those working with intersectional queer communities?
That's a great question. Well, I would say, well, I think it depends on our positionality. So many things. I was like, my brain just got crowded with like 3 things at once, but I've only got one mouth who can say one thing at the same time, at one time. I think that in terms of integrating the learning, there's a piece about accountability over time. And some of my cis colleagues, for example, have also been talking about creating communities of accountability. Now, communities of accountability, they're just as folks can go a little wrong sometimes. So it's also important that communities of accountability have a relationship with trans and non-binary folks, if that's the issue. But in terms of integrating this, it's practicing it every day. Like, and I don't know that we're going to be done practicing until we are done with life. Honestly, I still make mistakes. I still like say the wrong thing because I have that overcoupling. I'm 51 years old. That overcoupling of cisgenderism is really deep, within my body. And it's like, I think all of us, or most of us, I don't like absolutes, most of us have a lot of work to do around that unlearning piece. And often that's better done together. So I know I benefit from being surrounded by other people who also are questioning and practicing challenging cisgenderism in a lot of different ways. And also more deeply understanding identities and experiences that are not just my own, right? And so I think that practice is in our individual life. Can we look around and is our group of friends, do they all look like us? Maybe that's a question to ask yourself. Why does everybody around me look just like me? When you read a book, even if it's like, I love reading fiction, I read a lot of fantasy and sci-fi. Do I only read books by people who share my identities and again, look like me and sound like me? What media do I consume, right? It's like, well, all those choices we do in our everyday life, and then those choices we do as providers in terms of what trainings do I attend, which colleagues do I consult with, whose supervisions do I seek if I'm a mental health provider, I'm in that pre-licensure track, whose mentorship do I seek, right? Who am I accountable to? Right? So it's a lifelong process. I think that's the best I got. It's a lifelong process that impacts every aspect of your life, and you're going to make many mistakes. I've made many mistakes. I still make many mistakes, and that's going to be okay. That's that piece. Like and again, perfectionism is another aspect of white supremacy, right? So if we can let go of that perfectionism that expects us to do it right straight away and to have the right answer, because that's trauma too, right? It's right and wrong. That's all or nothing thinking. That's, that's most of the time things are so much more complex than that. And so that's a constant challenging of that polarizing of right or wrong, of the expectation of perfectionism within ourselves and others and so on.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I will ask one final question here. How do you feel about the terms woman, so WOMBAN, and woman spelled with an X instead of an E or A? I recently had to remove myself from an opportunity because they didn't use the term non-binary people, and instead were using these alternative ways of spelling women, WOMEN, as a way to honor, in quotes, femmes. I know they were confused, but I felt it would have been too much work to educate them, so I just removed myself. Excuse me.
I mean, that makes sense, right? We get to do that. It's like, do I want to engage with this? Nah. So that I would say, yay for knowing your boundaries. That's the other thing that I forgot to talk about. It's like, how do we do that boundary work on a somatic level with ourselves and our clients, right? Around this, when we want to engage or when we want to disengage in an intentional way. You know, I'm 51, languages change a lot. I've got papers out there that have been published with natal sex and male bodied and female body, which is totally cisgenderist language because I didn't know any better. And now I do, you know, so language changes. I think that some of this XY spelling, some of it came from good intention, some of it didn't. Some of it is just plain confusing, right? I'm always like, what are you trying to say? Like, you know, let's be really precise, you know, when it's a XYZ only space, like, so are we talking about basically we just want to leave cis men out, but we don't want to say that? Like, you know, I'm always like, or are you collapsing non-binary assigned female at birth folks with women in some way, shape, or form, but not as welcoming of like trans feminine folks, including non-binary folks who are assigned male at birth? And why does that even, the assigned gender at birth, why does that even matter when we're talking about non-binary? And why do we keep using it and bringing in the conversation? So, you know, for me, it's like it takes a lot of conversation to understand where people are at, and then a lot of work to tell them maybe this is not the language you want to use. And so, yeah, sometimes we choose to engage in those conversations, sometimes we don't. I would say that sometimes changing the spelling doesn't mean that we don't have to change the way we think. And so it's a bypassing of actually really addressing what are we trying to say here. And sometimes it's great. And sometimes maybe we want to be creative in our spelling. And maybe sometimes it's a way of bypassing, if that makes sense.
It does. And there was one last question about language, actually.
Do it.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Thank you so much. Like, here we are. Wow, you're amazing.
I love this community. I was like, wait, we're here, engaged. People are here. Let's do it.
I'm so grateful. I think we all are. I'm curious. I am a cisgendered woman. Is there a way to speak to, I have to say somatically, that is actually very hard for me to say. That I know I'm reading somebody else's thing, but I am not that. And it's hard for me to say. I'm curious, I am a cisgendered woman. Is there a way to speak to the sex organs when exploring the organ body that is not harmful? Or how do we orient this work to be inclusive?
I love that. You know, I mean, as well as having always been active in terms of sex education, even when I was a youth worker in my late teens, early 20s, I've always, you know, I'm a sex therapist as well as all the other stuff. And I was an HIV researcher. So I literally had to talk about which genitals do you have and who puts what in where, you know, for certain pieces of research. Literally, I was like, I need to know what genitals you have, your partners have, and who puts what where, because that's about risk, right? And I was like, that sometimes it's essential to talk about those things, right? So I would say just talk about the body parts you want to talk about people's vagina and vulva and clitoris and penis and testicles. And if you're talking to trans and non-binary folks and there's an issue of genital dysphoria, ask the other person what they want. How do they want you? Sorry, I'm starting to be a little tired, obviously. How do they want you to refer to their genitals? And also don't make assumption that just because somebody is trans and non-binary that they're going to have genital dysphoria. I had a really nice new affirming provider to have an OBGYN appointment, and he was trying to be so affirming that he actually made an assumption about how I felt about the OBGYN appointment, which was completely like incorrect, you know. And I was like, this is annoying and traumatic enough without me now lecturing you about what you just said, doctor, but another time maybe. So it's so important, like we can absolutely talk about bodies. Let's talk about people's chest, about people's anuses, about people like vaginas and penises and clitoris and testicles and ovaries. We don't have to gender them. And also that's the other piece of overcoupling, right? If, for example, transmasculine folks might look at kind of their clitoris as a penis in the same way that, or as it's theirs. It's not even like, same as some trans feminine folks don't think of their penis as a male, in air quotes, sex organs, it's their clitoris. And there's a lot of things that people can be creative and do with their genitals. And some people have genital dysphoria and some don't. So when it comes to sex organs, really just talk about what you're trying to say and and if we don't have any better language, we use the scientific language we have at our disposal. But also we can check in, right? That's that piece of relational reflexivity that John Burnham talks about. Reflexivity is not just about reflecting on our practice, but relational reflexivity is checking in with our clients about whether what we're doing is working for them. Hey, we need to talk about your sexual health or sex organs for whatever reasons. What words do you use for your genitals? Yeah. That's not a hard question to ask, I don't think, but maybe that's because I'm a sex therapist. And it's like I talk about sex like it's breakfast. So, and it took a lot of practice to do that because our culture. But
I think that's true. I used to work with foster youth a lot, and so I, not nearly as in depth, but certainly had conversations I wouldn't have otherwise had.
Oh, absolutely.
So there are new questions coming in.
I'm okay until let's keep going for another 10 minutes. I was like, I might be a little tired, but I'm loving this. And I don't often get the opportunity to hang out with this many SE folks. So let's do it.
Awesome. Oh my goodness. A follow-up on language. As a South Asian woman, I have always worked on creating, quote, safe spaces for folks who identify as women, because we don't have many of those in our culture, unfortunately. In making titles for workshops where women are requesting to only be around other women, how do we inclusively say the space is for women and folks identifying as women? Is that discriminatory in and of itself? I struggle with this quite often.
That's a beautiful question. I think that, we need spaces where it's like women's spaces were really instrumental for a lot of my healing. Personally, when I was in my teens and early 20s. And so I have a lot of love and gratitude for those spaces. I think that, hopefully if there is an intention to be exclusive, you can just say it's a women only space, and that means all women. And if you want to be really clear, you can say that includes I would just say that includes all women. And if they want to be really specific, you can say, and that does include trans women and trans feminine folks. And we want to state that because that's not always the case, right? Whatever language is appropriate to the group. I think that different groups and communities use different language. But if the intention is to be inclusive, that's a women's space. Now, if it's if that's what it is, right? Sometimes people are trying to have a women's space that's including like non-binary folks who have a uterus and or assigned female birth. And so that's a little bit trickier because my question is always like, why? Like I remember like somebody in spiritual community kept inviting me to this new moon rituals, like, but you can come. And I was like, it's not a matter whether I can come. The question is that can a trans woman come? And then we're gonna have a different conversation. Also, why do you assume that can come? Right? Again, the overcoupling, right? And so I think it's beautiful to have women only spaces, and they need to be inclusive of women. And we can't assume that certain people, because of their bodies, identify as women or not, or vice versa. Don't know if that makes sense or is a satisfactory answer, but that's what I got.
Somebody who also spends some time in women's circles and feels different about it at times. I think that makes a lot of sense. So thank you. Actually, somebody asked a similar comment about that actually before the question, but while I agree with boundaries, it's important to acknowledge that trans and non-binary are in a perpetual loss of community. I've lost all my gendered healing spaces.
Absolutely.
So I think those two go together.
Yeah,
and then
Oh, sorry, I was just gonna speak to that. There is a grief, I think, I don't know for other folks, but for me as a non-binary person, often there's like a nowhere to go in terms of gendered spaces. And there's a grief. I did a whole gender stories episode about being a non-binary abuse survivor and what it meant to have a loss of women's spaces, and you know, the loss of sisterhood, in air quotes, and how that impactful that was. And so I just really want to take a breath to acknowledge that there's a loss sometimes, and especially for those of us who also live in liminal spaces, the loss can be acute. I think it can be acute for anybody, but for me, has been acute sometimes not to have spaces where I feel like I can bring my whole self, right? And in a certain way. And so that's very real. So I just wanted to say that. Yeah.
Thank you. I feel that deeply, very deeply actually, and have tried to both be part of and find non-binary spaces. And it's tough, right?
It's
And what does
tricky.
that loss mean?
Yeah.
I think that is a lovely place to end. Alex, I learned so much from you today. I expect everybody here did. The way you held this with such care and love and heart, and also the SE side and piece to it touched me, and I can see from some faces here how much it touched others as well. I've actually never been part of an ending of a webinar, so I have no idea how the team here is going to do this. But I wanted to say personally, thank you so much. And on behalf of the organization, let me just say again, I know this was difficult. We have as an organization have fallen so far behind, and I think it's clear as somebody who's non-binary that this impacts me quite deeply personally. And as an organization, we have to do better on not just issues surrounding gender, but all intersectional issues. And so thank you for making sure that we continue to do that. For everybody here, for everybody in the past and the future. And this webinar was beautiful and brilliant, and thank you.
Well, thank you. I love my SC community. Yes, SCI has got a lot of work to do. I was really disappointed when I heard that things hadn't really moved anywhere since 7 years ago when I started my training, and I'm hopeful that they're moving. I want to believe that. And I hope there is as much excitement when I do the Challenging Ableism workshop in a couple of months, because we also need to talk about disability and ableism in somatic communities. But that's just a little plug that's coming too. And I hope there is as much interest in challenging and dismantling ableism in our healing community as well. But thank you so much for having me today. And thank you for all the folks who've been hanging out for like an extra half hour. I really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you everybody for being here.